A very good morning to all of our listeners. It is March 14th, and this is the Fulcrum podcast. Fulcrum is the commentary and analysis website of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. My name is Julia Lau, and I'm one of Fulcrum's editors. I'm very pleased this morning to have with me Deputy Assistant Secretary Melissa Brown from the U.S. Department of State. Ms. Brown has led the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs since September 2021. A career diplomat, she leads on Southeast Asia policy and was formerly chargé d'affaires to the U.S. mission to ASEAN in Jakarta, as well as counselor, economic and political affairs in Singapore. An alumna of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., she speaks Indonesian and French. Good morning, Melissa. Nice to meet you.
Good morning. Great to see you.
Welcome to ISEAS.
Thank you.
So you made a speech here yesterday, and that was public, but I think some of our listeners may not have had the chance to listen to it or read about it in detail. We're just going to start nice and easy with sort of a broad overview, if you will, of Southeast Asia from the U.S. point of view, and a big concern that was raised repeatedly during yesterday's closed-door sessions, which is Sino-U.S. relations. So generally, a couple of quick questions, and feel free to take as long as you need to answer them. How do you see the current state of Southeast Asia-U.S. relations? And how would you address concerns among Southeast Asian countries, especially amongst the elites or the political leaderships, that they see tensions between the U.S. and China worsening or increasing to the point of rivalry and to the point of sort of tension that this region is very worried about?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm happy to be with you and with the listeners here today. Let's I guess step back and talk about 2023, the year 2023.
Sure.
It was a really exciting year for the United States relationship with ASEAN and with Southeast Asia more broadly. There was a ton of momentum building, specifically on ASEAN, related to the 2022 special summit that we had back in Washington, D.C., that President Biden hosted. But now, we're really focused on implementing that comprehensive strategic partnership, implementing that elevated relationship. Above all, we talk left and right about how the U.S. supports ASEAN centrality. We want an independent ASEAN. And that has really enabled us to engage even more as the United States with ASEAN on the full range of issues, the full types of cooperation. Let me quote the president, because that's always a good thing to do.
Sure.
President Biden has said that the relationship between the United States and ASEAN is absolutely vital for the future of our 1 billion people, that's taking ASEAN and the United States together. So look, there's a lot more to be done specifically, but we're really looking forward to running ahead. In particular, we've got a number of the thematic areas of cooperation, from transportation to health to climate. These are the issues where we've heard the demand signal from ASEAN, and we're really excited about what we can do together. But let's also kind of step back on the bilateral front. Two of the things I'm most proud of over the past, year or two is upgrading our relationships with two other Southeast Asian countries. In September, we had a really historic upgrade, and in fact, it was a double upgrade of our U.S.-Vietnam relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. I managed to go to Vietnam 4 times in 6 weeks. We achieved what we were, in some ways, it was certainly felt like achieving the impossible, but we really were impressed both by the commitment on the Vietnamese side and our side of where we can take the relationship forward. The same time, in November, we had President Jokowi come to the United States, and we also upgraded the U.S.-Indonesia relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Same thing. Where does Indonesia want to head into the future? Where does the U.S. want to head? Where are we doing things right? Where do we really need to intensify our engagement? Let's turn briefly to Singapore, since we're here in Singapore, and I know a lot of your listeners, that's where they want to focus the conversation. My direct boss, our Assistant Secretary for the whole East Asia and Pacific Affairs, he was here just a couple of weeks ago. That was the 6th iteration of the U.S. Singapore partnership dialogue. And that's really broad. We talk about everything. I heard that it went over time, and they kept joking that they could have added on another day. But we also established some new dialogues that are more specific. And I think that's where with Singapore, we're already doing so much. So sometimes it can be difficult to continue to find new areas, but the world's changing. So critical and emerging tech, that's a really, really exciting new mechanism between the United States and Singapore, the dialogue we have there. And then also I'd say space and cyber. You can tell these are all future looking. These are economic focused. So I think it really is a testament to working with our friends, with our partners, with our allies. Where do we want to head together in the future, and really being responsive listeners on both sides to target that cooperation.
Right. That's a great and very sort of comprehensive answer. So I'm going to focus a little bit about the minilaterals, which is a word that is super hard to say early in the morning. So for people who don't know, there are these newer arrangements between the U.S. and some of its partners and allies, such as the Quad and AUKUS. So from your point of view, where you're sitting, do you think they are gaining traction in this region?
Yeah. So I guess, again, like when I think about the Indo-Pacific strategy more broadly, and we just celebrated the second anniversary, we've been doing a series of events. When people sometimes ask me about the minilaterals, they're like, well, what about ASEAN? What about the United Nations? What about our bilateral relationships? And one thing I'm always emphasizing is one does not preclude the other. Our relationship with ASEAN, we are all in. That upgrade was really significant, that special summit. And again, I mentioned implementation is our challenge now. That's where we're rolling up our sleeves and working hard. Same thing with other multilateral organizations. We have strong relationships bilaterally. We have strong relationships in the established multilateral sphere. But what we're doing that's a little bit more creative in this administration is working with friends, partners, and allies where our interests align, and creating, mini groupings, because the idea is we're always stronger if we're not going at it alone. And so, for instance, on Quad, there are some significant new initiatives where we can complement our regional architecture, our earlier security arrangements. Same thing with AUKUS. So I'm not concerned that one will take away from the other. Frankly, we're seeing a lot of convergence on both the opportunities as well as some of the membership of the groupings. We talk early and often with a range of folks, those involved and not involved in the minilaterals. There's no desire to feel like we're creating something new and leaving the other things behind. So I just say on the Quad, we really intensified our economic focus, because that's what we heard across the region. I focus on Southeast Asia, so that's where I'll focus what I'm discussing about. But people want to do more on infrastructure, climate, health security, critical and emerging technologies. And while the U.S. is really strong and has a lot to offer in those topics, our three other partners in the Quad, they bring something else to the table. And so figuring out who leads, who complements, who already has inroads, what companies are already there, what companies have the greatest interests, how we can partner up on financing. I think, just even stepping back, the initial engagement we did here in Southeast Asia through the Quad was with vaccines.
Right.
And I think having more folks involved there was only to our benefit to get people those safe vaccines early and often. I think they are gaining traction, but it complements. It takes time, and it complements what we're always doing. I think in particular here in Singapore again, we always are quick to brief and share of what the United States is doing in all sorts of channels, including these minilaterals.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is anxiety, if you will. I think there's a lot going on in the world, the greater world, and with two wars going on in different regions.
Yep.
Southeast Asians are very nervous, and that's a sort of expected response. But that's a reassuring answer. We'll now go to probably the most serious question. Well, I guess there are two serious questions coming up. That idea of presence, right? American presence in the region, and thinking about the wider world. So everyone knows what's going on in Ukraine and Gaza. There are some people in the region who fear that we may see if you will, a retrenchment from the region by the U.S., which is not the message at all that you've said and all your colleagues yesterday have said.
Yeah.
I kind of think of the region sometimes as a bit needy, right? We need to hear, but we also need to see this reassurance. But this question focuses more on American domestic politics. It now is clear after Super Tuesday that it's going to be Trump-Biden 2.0. And I actually lived in the U.S. during Trump-Biden 1.0. I lived in D.C. and Arizona, which are two very different states.
Yeah.
D.C. is not a state, but what is your take on this, and what do you think the U.S. would like the region to know that no matter what happens and who wins, and I think this was touched on yesterday as well. What would you like the region to know about American presence in the region?
Yeah, it's a great question, and look, there is a lot going on in the world, and we take very seriously, Russia's war on Ukraine, as well as the Israel Gaza crisis that's going on right now. And that takes a lot of intensive diplomacy. But what I can assure you is that there are continuing efforts, continuing resources committed to the Indo-Pacific, in particular Southeast Asia. And one thing I keep stressing is, what is a clearer signal than having a new Deputy Secretary of State that was the Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council previously? He's very well regarded across, globally, but as our country's probably leading Indo-Pacific expert. So the fact that the Secretary of State would select him, and he has made it very clear that he will continue to be bold and ambitious for what we're going to achieve in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and we love that. We set our prospects high. You said something that I wanted to follow up on, the needy reassurance comment. I actually don't feel that way.
Good.
The way I feel it is like, with any relationship, you can never be so lazy that you feel like, said I loved you. You know it. I'm never going to show it. I'm never going to continue to work on the relationship. I think, when you have this trust, like the United States and Singapore have, it's continual back and forth. It's, I mentioned it earlier, but it's the communicate early and often. It's the talk through on the issues where we see a lot of synergy, like this new emerging technology discussion. And frankly, like we do so much in the economic front, but also spanning people to people and security and climate. We have those conversations, but there are also times where we have different points of view. And the thing that I always love about engaging Singaporean diplomats, Singaporean government officials, and frankly, Singaporean stakeholders of all kinds, including, think tanks, thoughtful think tank leaders like yourself.
Quite a leader. Okay, we'll take that.
It's like, just give it to me straight. Like, we don't have to agree on everything. We can have a very productive, professional conversation, and we can strategize together. And I always feel like it's frank, it's honest. The United States really appreciates advice from countries like Singapore, and we try our very best, and I hope that this is clear, to also listen, to not do all the talking, and also to, hear, that's one of the things when I'm out on trips like this, I like to hear from all different Americans and Singaporeans of what their perspective is. And I always welcome, what are we doing well and what can we do better? So I do feel strongly, coming back to your original question, that even with everything that's going on in the world right now, that the future of the Indo-Pacific, the centrality of Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific, just whether it be demographics, whether it be the economic might, it is absolutely in the U.S. interest to remain engaged. So I, regardless of who wins the next election in the United States, I feel like we've already invested so much, and we will just continue to build off those connections and those relationships to stay engaged in the region. I also told some of your colleagues yesterday, the funny thing is I follow politics out here in the region. So I'm following right now what's happening in Thailand. I'm following, the recent Indonesian election. I know all the ins and outs. I barely follow U.S. politics because I am a career foreign service officer who serves whatever administration we have in place. I can tell you as someone who has invested my whole 20-something career to Southeast Asia that we have respected leaders of all parties who really, really value what we're doing out here in the Indo-Pacific, and I don't expect that to change.
That's great. And I guess to extend the metaphor about our relationship, this is the sign of a mature relationship. And
Yeah.
I think that's certainly what U.S. Singapore have. So moving on, probably this is the trickiest question, maybe. It is the holy month of Ramadan, especially in this region and the Middle East. There are other concerns, given what's going on in Gaza. It's now extended into, we're coming upon the 6-month mark now after October 7th last year, with the attacks by Hamas. So domestically, President Biden has taken on some positions that even cause sort of domestic discomfort, but also in this region, I think a lot of people either have reservations or may have criticized American policy on Gaza vis-a-vis Israel, because I think they find it very hard, right, to reconcile certain positions in foreign policy when it comes to this issue, say, versus Ukraine, for instance. To some people, there's no difference. There shouldn't be no difference if women and children, for instance, are being hurt or, things like that. And I'm wording things very, very carefully because it's a very, very tricky area to touch. What would you say to our listeners? How would you address this sort of seeming contradiction? And I use seeming with all the care that I can muster in American foreign policy. It's touchy for all the countries in this region, especially the majority Muslim ones, as you well know.
Absolutely. And I was in Indonesia just last week, and so I certainly heard a lot from young people, from business people, from government officials. So and in the U.S., like this is what's featuring at the dinner party. This is what's featuring, what people are talking about on the news and just everyday people. So I absolutely understand. The way that, I think I always like to draw on, I mentioned earlier, like it's always good to quote the president, quote the vice president. So I won't actually literally quote them, but on the other hand, I was reading through some of the statements that they've made publicly over about the last 10 days. And so, I understand there's been criticism in the region, there's been criticism in the U.S. about our approach to this issue. And of course, again, I'm a Southeast Asia expert, not a Middle East expert. This is what I was pulling from those recent discussions, is there's really a 3-pronged approach that the U.S. is taking. And I can assure you, every time I go and, participate in a meeting where the Secretary of State or any of his colleagues, the Deputy Secretary, they still care about Southeast Asia. That's why I'm up there. But on the other hand, they are working so hard on addressing what's going on in Gaza. And so what I would say the three areas of focus are right now is, number 1, releasing hostages, number 2, access to aid, and number 3, ceasefire. So when it comes to number 1 and releasing the hostages, I think there are really intense efforts, not only by the U.S. I'm not going to name all the countries. People are working really hard. But one thing I will say from the American perspective is we're not just trying to free American and Israeli hostages. There are also a number of other nationalities, and I particularly want to flag the Thai hostages that are still being held, a number of whom were migrant workers who were doing farming. And so I think we've worked very closely with the Thai government. We want to make sure that as we advocate for the release and safe return of all of these hostages, that the Thais, because there's a smaller number than there are, of course, of Israelis and Americans,
We want to make sure
that they're not forgotten. So across the board, we got to get those hostages home safely. The second point is back to the access for aid. And I think that this is where, I mean, my heartstrings are pulled the most, and I think where we're all having the strongest reaction, and we should, because of what you exactly said earlier. We know that there is urgent humanitarian assistance needs, and that we need to help to alleviate the suffering of innocent Palestinians who have absolutely nothing to do with Hamas. To make that very clear, we need for aid, we need for commercial deliveries to be able to consistently enter Gaza. I think I will underscore that the United States has urged Israel to immediately do what is needed to enable the UN and also international NGOs to respond and to keep those border crossings open for the humanitarian aid to enter. So that is a huge significant push, and I know this is evolving every day about what's getting in and what's not, and what role the U.S. is playing. The third one comes to the ceasefire. We have stated very clearly that we are working hard to advocate for a ceasefire at least 6 weeks. I think, remember, 6 weeks is the floor here. We are aiming for a ceasefire. I think it's in all of our interests. So again, pushing really hard to get the hostages home safely, and hostages of all nationalities, pushing really hard to ensure that the Palestinians that are not at all affiliated with Hamas have these urgent humanitarian needs better met. They're not being met right now. And then the third one, in order to come up with a more permanent solution, we need there to be a ceasefire. 6 weeks, bare minimum. Let's push and see if we can achieve something even greater than that.
Right. Well, we'll leave it at that. It's one of the trickiest problems, I think, right now in geopolitics to solve. But I think everyone would agree about ceasefire as soon as possible, and for as long as possible. So now we'll turn a little bit to America's economic engagement in the region. We're going to get into a bit of an alphabet soup in a minute.
I love acronyms,
right?
though. I don't.
Do you?
No, not at all. I can never keep them all straight.
So this first point was touched on a lot yesterday, and I hear the message loud and clear. But for our listeners again, so several Southeast Asian countries see the logic of what might be referred to as decoupling. Specifically decoupling the U.S. or other economies from over-reliance on a certain country for their economies. However, in this region, there's a very tangible impact when we talk about decoupling. And again, a needy question, how would America address these concerns, specifically to decoupling?
So I guess we don't see it as decoupling, because I think the idea is de-risking, but I can take it even 35,000 feet. The United States relationship with the PRC is focused very much on competition, but also cooperation. And I think one thing that I've heard in my trip around the region this week is a lot of positive reinforcement for the channels of communication between the United States and the PRC, and the fact that we're talking through not only the easy stuff, but also the areas where we don't agree. So I mean, I'm a diplomat, so of course I think those sort of conversations are incredibly vital as we move forward. But and there's been some really great developments in terms of cooperation, including on fentanyl, which we had a Chinese delegation, quite significant delegation in the U.S. just a couple of weeks ago. And I mentioned earlier, people talking about the Middle East in the U.S. People are also talking about the fentanyl crisis. It's really hitting home for a lot of Americans, really important to us. So I think it's a great development that we're able to have those conversations with the PRC on fentanyl and the precursor chemicals, and trying to see what we can do to work together. But the defense of U.S. economic interests, the protection of our technology, one of the reasons you can do all this amazing high-tech innovation in the U.S. is because the feeling is that those ideas and that intellectual property, that creativity, is not going to be used for the wrong impact, and it's not going to be stolen. It's rather going to be protected. So I think when it comes to some of the initiatives you see coming from the U.S. side, it's very much security focused, and ensuring that U.S. companies are playing by the same rules as everybody else. I know Singapore, like me, total rule follower, and the rules need to be the same for everybody to give a level playing field. If some folks break the rules and there are no repercussions, that really just, I think, will stifle innovation. It will stifle economic prosperity. People aren't going to want to invest, and they're just, not going to have the same ability to create economic growth. So I think this is a much broader issue. But again, what the U.S. is doing is we're working for our interests, but we're also working for our U.S. national security.
Right. And I never took IP law, but there's sort of a joke about IP, which is it's not intellectual property unless you've created some and want to protect your own. And I think often in this region where sometimes plagiarism or minor cheating is tolerated or even accepted or expected. It's a hard conversation to have, but I think it must be had. And yes, Singapore is a rule following country, and we love for everybody to follow the rules. Then everything of life would be simple, and we won't have to have podcasts about difficult topics. This is the last sort of big question. There is some views that the U.S. is not part of three major pieces of regional economic architecture, and this is where we get into our alphabet soup.
Yeah.
We have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We have the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yes.
And IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. Some people may criticize the last one, IPEF, for lacking the punch of tariff reductions. What would you say to that?
So this is how I approach things in general. I think you can poke holes in any bit of that alphabet soup. Every single one of those acronyms, there's strengths and minuses, perhaps. I believe in focusing on the strengths, and I think IPEF has a number of things to celebrate. So when I think about the U.S. approach on economic leadership more broadly, I will say that we are working very hard to prioritize investments to encourage innovation, to strengthen economic cooperation, competitiveness, to produce good paying jobs, not only in the U.S., but elsewhere, to strengthen supply chains, to expand economic opportunities for all across the Indo-Pacific. And just a reminder, the United States is absolutely a Pacific nation. So yes, this is good for the U.S., but I think it's also good for the Indo-Pacific more broadly. Private investment, economic competitiveness are really, really key. So we're pushing and promoting those as well. And looking how can we close the region's infrastructure gaps? That's always something I'd say probably the theme of the last 10 years of working in Southeast Asia, where that's the real demand signal of where the market isn't just going to do its thing. We need to be really, really focused on how we can address those gaps. Our trade, the U.S. trade with Southeast Asia, it reached a record $520 billion just last year. But even more impressive in some regards is that the U.S. remains the largest source of foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia. That's providing jobs, that's supporting millions of workers across the region. Singapore specifically, it's the 20th anniversary of our free trade agreement. And that has really, that has been something that's often used as an example of such an enduring commitment that's really paid off when you look at the economic ties between our two countries. But we've also, like we hosted the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, just last year in the United States. IPEF, as you mentioned, the partners, they recently signed very first of its kind, the supply chain agreement. That's the pillar that has already entered into force. I know there's still hard work that needs to be done, but we have created the framework, and now we will continue to move forward. The clean energy agreement, the fair economy agreement, or the two other pillars of IPEF that we've already finalized. So I think that's exciting development. But again, let's work on making sure that IPEF is fulsome. We are consulting and having really honest conversations with all types of stakeholders. We are also working shoulder to shoulder with our IPEF partners. And I will say, just shout out to Singapore in terms of just really being constructive and trying to make these agreements the absolute best that they possibly can be. It's not conventional. It's not supposed to be conventional. So it requires a lot of creativity in approaching things in a new way. But, I think supply chains is the one that really jumps out at me, but clean energy too. Yeah. People talk about supply chains following the COVID-19 pandemic and how we had so many gaps there that we need to address. But also, climate change. When I talk to young people across the region, that's what they want to talk about. They don't want to talk about a lot of the things we're talking about here. That's the true existential threat, and there's no debate that's what keeps them up at night. So I think it's exciting to see some of the investment that we're doing in clean energy across the region. We've got some great bilateral initiatives as well. So I think, again, economic leadership by the United States, it may not be coming in the same flavor and in the same means that we've seen in the past, but I do think that there are some exciting initiatives. We are working really hard, shoulder to shoulder with our partners, to make sure that they have teeth, that they're going to benefit all of the member countries, that they're going to benefit our workers, our companies, all the other stakeholders.
Actually, when you mentioned climate change, there was a barometer survey of the region that was released. Some of it released in the Straits Times either yesterday or today that says climate change is one of the key concerns. Jobs is always top in the region, but climate change is creeping up, even among older people in the region as well, because I think they see the effects on their livelihoods as well, especially their farmers or work with the environment and all that. Which is a wonderful point to sort of jump to our final question. And this is a nice, easy, hopefully, question. I always like to ask my guests whether you have anything personal to say in terms of reflecting upon your career in diplomacy, or if you knew of younger people in anywhere in the world, especially in this region, who aspire to be a diplomat like you. What would you tell them? Or, what's the most fun you've had?
So actually, most fun you had, that's a really good point, because I think I have the coolest job out there. Yeah. Every element, isn't pure joy, but wow, like what an opportunity. And I love the fact that I can be so hands-on. And then I can also, 1 minute I'm briefing the Secretary of State, and then the other minute, I'm rolling up my sleeves and helping my colleagues at an embassy prepare for a visit. And we're just, we're printing out paper packets. So I love that. I love the hands-on work. But I think in terms of career advice and the way I've approached it, so I was sharing yesterday that I first moved to Southeast Asia almost 30 years ago as a teenager. And it delighted me in the sense of my feeling was Southeast Asia was so colorful that the rest of the world kind of seemed black and white. It was Jakarta where I first moved as a teenager, but I've spent my more than 20 year career as a diplomat in Southeast Asia. And back to your idea of having fun, what I've done is I've pursued assignments, I've pursued jobs where I want to be there. I'm excited about the work. I am incredibly curious. I love to know why people are making the decisions they're making. I love kind of the anthropology side of it. You know, when you're going shopping for the first time in a country and trying to figure out like, why is everybody looking at me? Oh, I wasn't supposed to grab the fruit myself. I was supposed to ask. I love the mystery, and I think that translates to diplomacy as well. So I guess the two bits of advice are, you know, find where your passion and where you're most excited and where you think things are colorful. When you feel that way, you'll do a better job. You know, the joy you have in what you're doing is going to be reflected. But also it's that curiosity, whether you want to be a diplomat or just in your everyday, learning new things every day, being open to listening and a different point of view and a different way of doing things. That's why I love traveling the world. That's why I love the generous Southeast Asian friends and colleagues that I've had who've helped me, you know, craft this expertise in the region. But again, I learn new things every day. Can't imagine a better job out there. Happy to be back in Singapore. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that was a great advertisement for the State Department and for the Foreign Service. Thank you so much for joining us today. And from one person with a passion for Southeast Asia to another, I wish you all the best in all the future things that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.